It's the Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams, and this is the podcast where we speak about generally endangered birds, the threatened species, the environmental catastrophes that are all around us, and we talk to the people who are trying to do something about it. But you might notice that my backdrop, if you're watching, is a little bit different. I have the Pint of Science logo up there, the artwork for the Pint of Science Takeover Festival. I think that's how we're going to describe it. I'm supporting it this year. I was kindly invited by my guest to take part, and it seemed like a good idea. It's bringing science to the masses, so I'm all about that. So, Elodie Camprasse, I think that's as good as my Australian will manage. Elodie's a doctor, not the medical kind, from Deakin University, and Elodie is also organising the Pint of Science Festival. So, Elodie, welcome. Thank you for being part of the Bird Emergency. Please tell us all about Pint of Science, and actually tell everyone how come you reached out to me.
Cool. Yep. So Pint of Science in more normal times used to happen in pubs. So the aim is to get, scientists talking about their work in pubs, in relaxed setting, in a non-jargony kind of way, so people can just enjoy a pint with their mates and, soak in some science. So obviously with COVID, we've had to pivot the festival, starting last year where obviously events in pubs weren't allowed. So we pivoted the festival online and had a bunch of different events, which we are continuing on this year. So we decided early this year that the festival was all going to be online because of the risk of lockdowns and restrictions happening in pubs. So we have a whole series of very exciting online events. Takeover is one of them. So this is what's happening now. So thank you for tuning in and thank you for having me. This is all about getting Pint of Science researchers out there onto existing radio shows and podcasts and talk about their latest work. Just thought the Bird Emergency would be perfect for that. We loved your work and we reached out to Grant and really happy to be here. And we have 3 other researchers that are do very interesting work as well, and certainly looking forward to hearing their work as well.
And so for listeners, Elodie is number 1 in our special bonus feature Takeover week. So consecutive days, you will be getting somebody who is one of the Pint of Science researchers. So we're a little bit off topic, but not terribly off topic, because Elodie has a terrific knowledge of penguins and all those other sub-antarctic birds, because Elodie spent 6 months, can you believe, on Kerguelen Island. So, Elodie, I know where Kerguelen is, but please tell us all where it is and don't tell me how you got there. You can tell us about how you actually got there in a little while, but what was your purpose going down there? What was the work you were doing?
Yep. So Kerguelen, I'm sure not a lot of people have heard of it. It's a French sub-Antarctic territory. Not even French people really know about it, to be honest. So you really have an excuse if you haven't heard of it yet. Tiny island in the middle of the sub-Antarctic Ocean. So if you draw a triangle pretty much between South Africa, Australia, and Antarctica, that's pretty much here in the middle. So the reason that I was invited to go there was to work as a field assistant, as a research assistant. So there's long-term research programs happening in the sub-Antarctic and in Antarctica as well. It's not just France that is running these programs. A lot of other countries do have sub-Antarctic territories or Antarctic territories, and they have monitoring of seabirds and also marine mammals happening there. So yeah, that was part of this. As part of these long-term monitoring programs, they send research assistants every year. So it's very, very competitive. But finally, after a few years of applying, got a position there, and it's, yeah, when I've traveled a lot, but this is completely out of this world. This is the best experience I've had in terms of being in wilderness and interacting with wild animals, because this is the kind of place where humans have only started sort of colonizing, if I can use that word, recently. So a lot of animals that live there, and it's mostly so seabirds and marine mammals breeding there, they haven't necessarily associated us as a threat. So you can actually be really close to them. You can, walk on the side of a penguin colony, for example, and birds. There's a few that might just be a bit freaked out, but mostly they just let you be there and do your thing, which is an incredible environment to be in.
You mentioned it's really, really competitive to get a spot on one of these expeditions, although it's more than an expedition, it's a placement, really, isn't it? Yeah. When did this happen, and were you already a PhD graduate, or was this pre your PhD thesis work?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, it was definitely pre-PhD. Actually, this was the other way around. The PhD didn't land me there. There was actually my PhD was kind of a continuation of this work in a way. But yeah, I was studying, that was my second year of bachelor back in France, northwest of France. And I just heard of this opportunity. The city is called Brest. That's where the Polar Institute is situated. And I just heard an event, I think it was like a public talk about the work that they were doing in sub-Antarctic territories. And one of my friends told me I don't know if that was a joke or a dare, but she was like, oh, maybe that's something you should try. And I was like, oh, certainly. And I went to this event, and then I was like, where do I sign? Please, like, I want to go now. And so I talked to some of the coordinators and people that were responsible for the selection of the applicants. And I was told that pretty much the best experience to have a better chance of being selected is any kind of experience with birds. So it could be bird watching, bird handling, mist netting, things like that. And I was like, at the time, actually, I was always an ocean lover, but I was more into fish and corals and things like that. And I thought, oh yeah, birds, I can do birds. Birds are interesting. So I started doing volunteering and internships in different organizations, different part of the world, and to have enough experience to apply for this program. And yes, I ended up applying 5 years in a row and getting rejected 4 times. And each time that was motivation to go and do more field work, more like what they wanted to see as well is people that had experience working in remote locations for very good reason, obviously. So I did that. It brought me to very interesting parts of the world. So I don't, in the end, regrets having, been rejected that many times. But it was certainly at the time feeling that my dream was getting away from me every time, and then in the end it worked out. So yeah.
So can I get the timeline right? Your friend told you about the talk, and you went to the talk in your second year of your bachelor.
Yeah.
So by the time you finally got accepted, were you plugging your way through your master's or just finished your master's?
Yeah, I'd finished my master's. Yeah.
Okay, so was it was the fieldwork that you did in Kerguelen attached to another academic program? Like, was it were you able to set up part of your doctoral work down there, or were you just a freelance research assistant?
Pretty much freelance research assistant. Look, this is obviously, as I mentioned before, it's part of long-term monitorings of seabirds and marine mammals. So this data do end up being used by students, sometimes, the equivalent of honours, sometimes the equivalent of masters, sometimes even PhD students. But I was really collecting data for a whole range of projects and topics. So when I came back, I told my boss back in France that I wanted to do a PhD, and seabirds was really the thing for me at the time, and I would really want to study seabird. And he said, look, I love working with you, but I don't have any funding, unfortunately. So he was like, oh, but I've got a colleague in Australia who does work on little penguins and other seabirds, and he connected me with this researcher, John Arnold, who ended up being my PhD supervisor. It just happened that way that he got a scholarship for me, and we worked on penguins together. And I actually did go back to the sub-antarctic during my PhD to continue some of the work that I was doing here, and some of the questions that I had actually investigated back when I first went to Kerguelen.
So the long-term monitoring on Kerguelen was, when did it begin? Do you know when it began, and is it still continuing to this day?
It is. I couldn't tell you an actual date, but this has been going on for decades now. I would say at least 20 years. So they've been sending research assistants every year, doing population censuses, doing, marking, recapture kind of studies, studying pollutants as well. So, it's answering broad questions to do with climate change, to do with pollution, fisheries, things like that.
So how long were you there? I said 6 months. Was it exactly 6 months?
Well, on the ground, it was a little less actually, but the boat trip takes so long that altogether was about 6 months.
Well, let's place Kerguelen. You've drawn that triangle that it's South Africa, Australia, and Antarctica, and Kerguelen sits smack bang in the middle. A lot of people would be familiar with maybe South Georgia or Heard Island, Macquarie, one of the Australian territories. What is nearby?
Not a lot, actually. It's very remote, and it's one of the most remote locations you can get, But the closest islands are other sub-Antarctic territories, but it is, in terms of the bird populations, seabird population found there, and marine mammal, it'd be really similar to Macquarie Island.
And to get there, because it's a French territory, you're not heading over from South Africa or from Hobart in Australia or from Chile. You depart from a French territory in the Indian Ocean.
Yes, that's correct. So departures from Reunion Island, which is a tiny island near Mauritius and Madagascar. So we get there, we fly there, and then we take a boat called Marion Dufresne, and that's a big oceanographic vessel that does the loop connecting all the French sub-Antarctic territories. So that starts with Crozet, which is, depending on the weather, about 3 or 4 days navigation from Reunion Island. We usually stop there. So in every location, every island, the boat will stop usually for a few days if the weather's good enough. And there's an helicopter on board, so the helicopter just drops off, gas, water, fuel, etc., to the remote sites. Usually the way it works on these islands is that you've got a main base, which is where, it's a bit like a little village almost. It's pretty cozy. You've got, accommodation there. You have a gym. Sometimes you have a cinema, a library. Then you have the hospital as well. And then, so that's where most of the activity happens, where people, come in and out. But then on these islands, you also have what's called isolated sites. So there's like huts and cabins that have been built at different places that are strategic on the island. So they're, near colonies of breeding seabirds or breeding marine mammals. So that's anywhere between a couple of hours to, maybe a couple of days to walk to these sites. So yeah, that's kind of how this is organized on the ground. But yeah, sorry, I'm going back to your question now. So yeah, you leave from Reunion Island, then a few days down the track, you arrive at Crozet. There's a few days there, then goes to Kerguelen. That's another probably 3 or 4 days. And then to complete the loop that goes to Amsterdam Island, Amsterdam and St. Paul. And they are subtropical territories, and then goes back to Kerguelen Island in about a week. So the whole loop can take, 2 or 3 weeks. Sometimes if you go via what we call an oceanographic campaign, when they're actually doing measurements at sea, it can take up to a month. So it might take a bit longer because they have to stay stationary in some areas to do their measurements. So yeah, it's a long trip, and it's pretty incredible for people, in our modern times to be away from land for that long. You don't see any land for days on end, which is really, really cool, because that's where you get to the realm of, the wildest seabirds and, the albatrosses and all these ocean wanderers.
And the skipper of the ship, or is it a boat or is it a ship?
I think a ship.
A ship, yeah. Sometimes they don't call themselves ships, but it has to provision all of those sites. So it must be a huge logistical effort just for the skipper and the crew of the ship. And then everyone like yourself has to be really well organised to run the research station for at least 6 months. And you have to factor in that things might go wrong and you might be there for longer. So how did you prepare for that?
You get a list. As far as clothing and field equipment goes, you're sort of briefed on, what you should bring. Usually this is an adventure of a lifetime. So people that go, they do a lot of research, and they go read blogs from other people that have stayed, and, ask questions on Facebook. There's community groups from people that have been, and are, happy to give advice. But what you can take, which is very handy, is some very big metal boxes, and that goes by ship as well, months before you leave, actually. So you sort of have to send them in one central place, and then they're sent over by ship as you, preparing for the rest of your trip and get your training, because you do have to. So each research assistant that is sent over there will, have to go through training. They'll brief us on the conditions on the ground, but it's also to make sure that as a researcher, you know the protocols to follow and the methodology, and you're able to handle birds, seabirds, marine mammals. As I said, they do select people that already have some experience in handling birds, obviously. But yeah, you do training to make sure that you know how the equipment works, you know how to test the equipment. So regularly we work with what we call data loggers. So kind of the GPS that you have on your phone, and the accelerometer that you have on your phone that tells whether your phone is up and down. So that's pretty much the same basic equipment that we use on the animals for some of the research programs. So we do, attach these devices onto the backs of the birds, let them run for however long we need, and then retrieve the devices and get the data. So, yeah.
Before we talk about the amazing wildlife on Kerguelen, I want to ask about what it's like to be living with a group of others for 6 months where there's nowhere to get away from anybody. What was the crew size, the complement of the team that you joined? And did you have, were you sharing a room with bunks, 4 people or 8 people in a room? What were the conditions actually like?
Yeah, so I'll answer that, but before I forget, because I was going to clarify something in the question you asked me before and I didn't. So during summer, we actually not there for 6 months in a row. That's more what's called overwintering. In summer, on the other hand, the boat comes back every month or so. Again, it depends on the weather, but there's usually during summer about 4 different rotations. So the boat comes 4 different times, and that's where obviously they, take all the water and the food back to the shelters, the huts, and the cabins where we work. So it's not 6 months of pure isolation. That's not to say it's easy, but that's also one of the reasons why the competition is tough. That every candidate that the institution is interested in sending to the sub-Antarctic or Antarctica has to go through medical and psychological testing. So that's a full day spent in Paris, in the capital of France, where you see different doctors and do different questionnaires and talk to psychiatrists to make sure that you fit enough mentally and physically to go to this sub-Antarctic territories, because obviously, as you can imagine, the conditions are very, very tough. It's not just the remoteness of it all, but obviously, the weather is usually very cold, even in summer. Technically, the temperatures don't really drop below 0, but the wind chill is such that it feels really, really cold. So it's usually feels anywhere between sort of, let's say, -5 and -200. I don't know. I felt really, really cold over there. But that's mostly, when we out for most of the day, just in the field and exposed to the elements. But to go back to your question about how many people are there. So as I sort of mentioned, so there's a difference between people on the main base and people on this isolated site. So on the main base, Kerguelen is the biggest of the islands that we have in the sub-Antarctic territories. And in summer, it can reach about 110 people on the main base. And there's sort of, there's rotations through the summer, but that's kind of the maximum number of people that we have at that time. It will drop to about 50, I believe it has, if it hasn't changed since, in winter. So there's a much smaller crew staying in winter. Obviously, in winter, there's a lot less action when it comes to biological or ecological studies, which is why there's less people. So during summer, there are people that will only stay 1 month, for example, in between 2 rotations. But I was lucky enough to sort of stay the whole summer, austral summer. And so that's about 110 people. But then you go with a small crew to this isolated sort of sites, and you stay. Yeah, usually it's pretty small huts. So you'd go with a group of anywhere between sort of 4 people and maybe about 10, a bit less. And it's usually researchers that need the help of other volunteers. The volunteers are on base doing other duties, but they can be released from their main duties. So, it could be anything from, someone who's assisting the chef prepare meals to, the nurse, if it's a quieter time and he or she doesn't go very far away, can come back in emergencies. Or it could be military personnel as well. So we do have military presence on the islands, and those people, they get involved in running the base and running different or having different duties. Could be related to communication, could be related to maintenance or anything. So we do take those people with us on our field trips, and it could be sometimes a few days, and sometimes it's a few weeks. So our field trips kind of have different duration depending on what we're doing specifically during that trip. So sometimes it's just, going out and retrieving a few devices that are on seabirds, and sometimes it could be setting up a whole experiment, which will take, I don't know, a couple of weeks or 3 weeks. So the duration that we spend out in the field in isolated condition can vary quite a lot, but it is, yes, very cozy conditions. We all usually share. So they're usually little modules. So it's usually 1 or 2 little huts where we stay together. But I guarantee you, when it's that cold, you really want to be close together. Makes things a bit easier.
Snoring.
Yes, there's that as well. Fortunately, I am a very strong sleeper and I don't wake up very easily, but I'm sure it's a problem for some people.
So the selection criteria before you go down there doesn't sort the snorers out and say, sorry, you aren't coming.
None that I know of, but maybe I'll suggest it for people that, might be a problem.
Did anyone ever tell you a horror story?
Not that I can remember.
Oh, that's good. That's very good. Imagine having 6 months of sleep deprivation, as well as being really, really cold and getting covered in seabird poo. That would be hard work.
It is actually. It's funny you mentioned that, because sleep deprivation, I experienced a lot of it, and it wasn't because of snoring sleepers next to me. It was because some of the devices that we put on the birds, on penguins specifically, weren't quite working. So what we do when we put out expensive devices, like there's some expensive GPS loggers, for example, we want to be able to retrieve them for sure. So what we do is we put a little radio emitter and we have a device that, picks up
when it's within range.
Exactly. So this is really handy to have, like when you're doing your everyday things in the huts or even in the field, to know you hear the beeps and you're like, okay, well, this bird is back. I'm going to go and retrieve his devices before they leave again, because the problem is they can leave for a few weeks at a time. So if you're not there if you're not catching the bird right at that time to retrieve the devices, it could be that it's another 2 or 3 weeks you've got to wait to retrieve the devices, and you've got to obviously plan to be there at that time, which is a bit tricky. So it's crucial that we know when the birds are coming back. And unfortunately, and some birds get a bit shy after you've put devices on them, so they don't stay on land they tend to hide or don't stay on land very much. So you really have to catch them at that time. And some of them, particularly gentle penguins, were coming back at night. So that was fun because the devices weren't working. So we literally had to keep watches for most of the night with, usually me or a volunteer, but usually me outside in the wind, in the cold, with a penguin coming back at 2 or 3 in the morning, having to be ready to catch it and take the devices off. So yeah, lots of sleep deprivation on this trip for sure, but it was worth it.
Now, you mentioned that everybody has a specific role in the on the main base. So what was your specific role? Were you doubling on tasks like, does everyone have to help in the kitchen, or are you doing cleanup duty on a roster or something as well as your research task?
To an extent, yes, but so biologists get off the hook a bit because we're not on base very often. We're usually in the isolated sites where there's obviously not as much work to do in terms of cleaning or helping preparing the food or anything like that. Usually, no, I don't really think people help prepare the food, but we certainly help doing the dishes or cleaning the common areas and things like that. When I was there wasn't a roster. I think everyone's happy to participate, and just whenever you're free, just help out. So it's quite common after a meal, after lunch or after dinner when we're on base, half of the people go to the kitchen and help out with the dishes and things like that. So yeah, it works quite well. But yeah, my role was purely as a research assistant, and I spent most of my time really on isolated sites. There's actually, I think I can count on the finger of one hand, maybe 2 hands, the number of days that I actually spent on base. So that wasn't very long at all.
Now, let's talk about the amazing array of wildlife on Kerguelen. And you're obviously doing a lot of work with penguins. Tell us what's there and tell us what you did.
So what's there is, mostly seabirds and marine mammals. And it's, as I kind of mentioned before, it's just amazing to be able to interact with them and really live amongst them. You have fur seals or elephant seals, right across the beach where you're working. That comes with safety considerations, of course, but it's a lot of fun, and it's quite unbelievable to watch. Male elephant seals fight for females, defend their harems and things like that. And of course the seabirds. So there's about, I think the latest data is about 35 species of seabirds on Kerguelen, which is the most diverse of our sub-antarctic territories. So you have albatrosses, prions, petrels, gulls, terns, giant petrels, tom petrels, and of course penguins. So there's a few species of penguins, gentoo penguins I mentioned because that was one of the ones that I was studying, not just this trip but afterwards. Macquarie penguins, rockhopper penguins, king penguins. So very fun bunch of seabirds, really. And it's obviously, it's very precious to be able to find, to know that there's still a place on Earth that we haven't completely destroyed, and where these birds and marine mammals are able to be wild and free to an extent. That being said, we still experience litter on the beach, and it just breaks your hearts because you're thinking that you couldn't be further away from civilization, and yet you can still see evidence of destructive practices, whether it's things like fishing nets or plastic bottles or things like that on the beach, which is heartbreaking. But this is such a special place, and you can switch from I'm in love with everything I see and I want to spend the rest of my life here, to what am I doing here? This is ridiculous. This is so hard. I'm so cold. I'm so hungry. And it is, but it is, I guess if it wasn't that hard to get there and to live there, then everybody would do it.
Now, I have to ask a specific bird question for the bird folk. Are there cormorants, shags on Kerguelen?
Yes, they are shags, actually, which also was one of my study species for my PhD, so I can't believe I haven't mentioned them there yet. But yes, so this is part of what we call the blue-eyed shag complex, which is a group of shag species that are very beautiful, blue eyes and very elaborated mating displays, and they have the little crest on their head as well, which is really cool to watch when it's breeding season, at the start of the breeding season. And they are very cool birds to work with.
And are they poor flyers, that they're basically limited to spending their time on Kerguelen and the nearby smaller islands, or are they roaming around the sub-Antarctic?
No, they're actually good flyers, and yes, they are roaming around. So the Kerguelen shag, which was again species for my PhD, is endemic to Kerguelen Island, but you have other species that are found in a range of different sub-Antarctic territories. So yeah, and they're very interesting birds. I will say something very weird, and I understand that a lot of people will be completely disgusted, but one of the reasons why they're really exciting birds to work with is that they regurgitate their food when you manipulate them, which sounds very disgusting, and it is. But what's great is that it tells us a whole lot about what they eat without having to use very invasive techniques. Of course, manipulating the bird in the first place can be, thought of as invasive, but that's as little invasive as we can be, pretty much. But yes, so if you imagine a researcher with a Ziploc bag and a spoon just putting up the rest of the vomit in the bag just so they know what the bird has been eating. But it's really fun because this is actually the only way where you can actually see whole prey. Like sometimes you would have a whole squid or a whole fish that you can identify easily, because the way that seabirds ecologists study diet sometimes is from either stomach content or sifting through their poo, and there's also for marine mammals. So usually what you see, you can identify the prey items from the hard parts. For example, the fish have ear bones that are specific for each species. So if you only have that little part, calcified part that belongs to the fish, you can tell what fish it was, but you never actually see the prey and what they look like. In just looking at books, it's just in your ID book, you kind of get an image of what the fish looks like or the squid looks like, because you can identify them from the beaks that they have. But yeah, seeing them actually in person, fresh from the cormorant's mouth, is actually something pretty cool.
I want to ask you more about your PhD work, because you did mention that you went back to Kerguelen for a second time. So tell us what your PhD subject, research, was, and what did you discover that was either really important, groundbreaking knowledge, or really surprising?
I don't know if I could call it groundbreaking. There's certainly some surprising finds in there. So yeah, my PhD was looking at what we call individual specializations, specifically in foraging. So when the birds are feeding. So to put it in, human context, if you go back to the same supermarket over and over, either Coles or Woolies, I don't even want to start a war here, but if you go over and over to the same supermarket, then you'd be considered specialized, and you go there because it's convenient. You know the route to get there. You know where to park. You know where things are organized and where to find the pasta that you like, and other items. So in terms of birds, it's about the same, and actually every animal, really, if you think about it. So they have specialization. So they either go to the same places over and over to feed, or they just eat the same thing over and over. And so seabirds during the breeding season are what's called central place foragers, which means that they have their nest. That's where they have to come back to, because their partner is waiting as well with the chick or the eggs, and they have to rotate and sort of take their place so that they can also go and forage and bring back food for the chicks. So looking at a range of birds, I was sort of trying to quantify individual specializations in seabirds. So I mentioned the Kagan and Shags, and they're also fascinating because they're so specialized. So we put devices on birds over the course of the breeding season, and we found that even a few weeks later from the first time we put devices on them, they were still going to the same places and kind of just eating the same thing. And this is, makes sense when you think about the seabirds and their environment, because usually they nest in big colony. There's a lot of competition. So, if I say, Grant, you go and eat squids and I go and eat fish, we don't interfere with each other, and, we still have enough food to eat. So that's the kind of principle that these birds are using. But on the other hand, if you look at a bird like little penguins, for example, then we see that these specializations aren't necessarily in place. And in this context, so going back to the shags, what we think is happening here is that they're benthic eating seabirds. So that means they eat on the seafloor. And the seafloor potentially has a lot of features that they can use to navigate back to those places where they know the food is there, so the food that they like, that they eat. But if you think of a bird like a little penguin, it feeds in the water column while the prey is moving around, because they're usually things like schooling fish, so pilchards or anchovies or things like that. So it wouldn't necessarily make sense to go to the same place over and over, because by the time you get there, the school of fish might have moved on. Yeah, so they're more sort of generalist and kind of, just follow the flow and just stay in the patch where they found something, but don't necessarily go back to the same places. So we think that the feeding habits in terms of feeding in the water column versus feeding on the seafloor really influence the bird strategies.
Are the general population of the Kerguelen shag eating pretty much the same things, or do they have a varied diet within the species?
Yeah, so with diet, specifically with the shag study that I did, we don't have enough resolution to really say, this one's only eating worms as opposed to this one's only eating squid and this one only eating fish. But we can sort of say it's feeding, near the coast or further away, or it's feeding low in the food chain or high in the food chain, and studying. So we do that by studying what's called stable isotopes that are components of the blood and the feathers. And this is based on the principle that you are what you eat. So you eat something, you'll have the component, the signature of this something in your body. So if I sample the bird's blood, I will get the signature of the prey. But the problem is in order to really know what this is, the signature, what that corresponds to, you need to be able to sample all the prey species really, really well, which is very challenging in environments like the sub-antarctic, because for access reason, but also because the possible prey are so diverse. So we know that they tend to eat the same thing over and over again. We might not know exactly what it is, though, if that makes sense.
That would be a very, very big project to be able to do that. So what were your major findings? You've determined that the shag is a specialist feeder. What else did your work in particular discover?
Yep. So there's a very interesting study that we were able to do, and that was pretty new and exciting, because not a lot of studies on seabirds, sort of foraging ecology, are able to look at both members of a pair. Usually you have permit to tag one of the parents on the nest, for example, and you just, sample different nests. But as part of our experimental design, we were able to get a permit to sample both adults of a pair in Kerguelen shags. And the interesting thing is that we found that the adults in a nest in one pair tend to eat more similar things and go to more similar areas. So potentially they could be communicating where the food is and where the good patches are, and just kind of helping each other out. And we know that some seabirds are able to use cues from other birds. We're not sure about the pair specifically, but just in general, by just kind of observing them coming back to the colony, knowing where they're coming from. Potentially when they feed the chicks, they could also sort of get a sense of what's out there to eat, what's good, what's abundant. So yeah, potentially some communication there, although the experimental design wasn't definitely allowed to, wasn't, what's the word I'm looking for, able to show us that relationship. That's just an hypothesis. But yeah, certainly, because there is a question, if you're a seabird, and some of these strategies are also linked to personality. So they can be bold, for example, and tend to be more adventurous, go further away, or try to find different prey. Or you can be sort of shy and stay in the same area, just kind of play it safe, because you have a chick to feed, and you need to bring something back. The question becomes, in terms of the pair of the nest, what's more successful? Is it having two shy individuals, two bold individuals, or a mix? Like maybe one shy, one bold is better, because the shy one is going to bring back some food almost for sure, because they don't take risks, they know where the food is, but it might not be as sort of maybe diverse. It will lack some nutrients, or the individual that's bold could perhaps find bigger foods that would help the chick grow sort of faster. But in this study, we couldn't look at reproductive success per se, so we don't know what strategy is better in terms of raising an offspring. But it's an interesting observation that so these birds would have either be two shy birds together or two bold birds together, because they tend to feed in the same area and on similar things. So yeah, that's quite interesting. There's not a lot of studies out there, as I sort of mentioned, that will look at both members of a pair and actually, track them with GPS devices, or use stable isotopes to sort of understand their diets.
Now, research is only ever a little part of the story. So your work will have built on the work of somebody before you and then somebody before that. Do you know, is somebody going to be continuing the work that you were doing on the Shag and to really nail down some of those dietary habits and the breeding success that comes from what they eat?
Yeah, specifically on the shags, I'm not sure, but I certainly hope so. But it is challenging to fund those studies, especially as, you know, Kerguelen's so hard to access. So there's long-term monitoring programs happening. And then when there's a little bit more funding for example, a PhD student like myself a few years ago, or, you know, for a research assistant to go and work on a specific question, then yes, they might continue this work. As far as I know, there haven't been any funding to do that, but certainly it would be very interesting to tag the same birds that I have tagged, and I have, you know, GPS tracks for them. It'd be interesting because we found out that during the breeding season, they still go to the same place over and over, even a few weeks after the first time we've put devices on them. And it'd be really interesting to know how these patterns kind of hold over the course of several years, and if they still go to the same place, perhaps.
Are shags a bit like penguins, that they seek out the same mate year after year?
Yes. So they are pretty faithful to the nest and to the colony where they were born. Yep, absolutely.
So they seek out, if possible, the same mate and the same site to nest each year.
Yep.
Okay. How long do they live?
Oh, you're testing me now. I'm not sure.
Okay. I imagine they're fairly long-lived, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, you're now at Deakin University. What is your role at Deakin and I'm wondering what's your future goal in your academic pursuits?
Yes. So my role as at Deakin now is unfortunately not involving penguins anymore. I wish. At the moment, I don't do as much research. I do a whole lot of teaching. I do practicals in ecology, zoology, and statistics. But I'm kind of interested in switching gear a bit and doing research on human-wildlife conflicts. That is now the field that's fascinate me. It's a problem that certainly, you know, is relevant in seabirds, but I also work at Wildlife Victoria, which is, you know, Victoria's main rescue organisation. I've worked there for a few years now, about 5 years, and the data that we collect on human-wildlife conflict is amazing. So that's something that I'm fascinated by, because I come from Europe where we barely have any wildlife left, especially in urban environments. So when I came here and I saw rainbow lorikeets, blue-tongued lizards, ringtail possums, I was fascinated. And then it struck me that people don't appreciate, not all people, but generally it obviously comes with issues, because, you know, I understand that people don't want possums nesting in their roofs, or I don't know, cockatoos pooping on their lawn or something, I don't know, or bats. So it's to me, it's a very interesting space to be in, to try to understand, first of all, through this data that we collect, how we impacting urban wildlife, because there's now a push to create more spaces for wildlife in the city, and that's a great thing if we know how we impact them, in order to not sort of introduce more conflicts and introduce more risk for the animals. So that's one thing that interests me, but also I'm really interested in understanding, people's perception and attitudes toward wildlife, and how potentially we can switch negative attitudes towards, not necessarily positive because it's such big work, but at least towards neutral. So these individuals at least won't be at risk, impacted by human activities. So that's, I hope, my next step. If anyone listening that has a lot of money and want to fund that research, please do get in touch with me. I have been trying to get a postdoc in that field, and I'm hoping that's my next step.
Well, I think people need to chill out when it comes to animals and birds in the city. Flying foxes are fantastic. Just appreciate them, please.
Yes.
Yeah, they make a bit of noise and they poop on your washing if you leave it out overnight, but we're so lucky to have them. And cockatoos and corellas, they can eat up anybody's balcony as far as I'm concerned. The joy of having flocks of cockatoos, corellas, lorikeets, is astounding in this city and in other cities across the country. And I'm sure around the world. Look what's happening in Europe. You've got Indian ringneck parakeets, and people are treasuring them because there's nothing else. I mean, just lighten up, everybody. Yeah. Just lighten up. Now, we're going back to penguins for a minute. What's your favorite penguin?
Oh, that is hard. I think I really like the king penguins because they're so impressive and so big, and they dive so deep, and they have such beautiful colors. And we're just starting to actually understand, the communication and the, sexual selection that's associated with the beautiful orange and yellow colors they have on their chest and their faces. So yeah, I love king penguins. But that being said, I could give you 1,000 reasons why I love other penguins as well.
Well, we might have to have you back as a guest when we start doing a series on seabirds, and I'm sure there's a big appetite out there for people to talk about penguins.
I'd be happy to.
They're very popular, but we don't seem to have a lot of researchers out talking about them. Certainly not on the social media that I'm looking at. Elodie, when you're doing field work, what's your, I don't want to say favorite piece of equipment, what's the most essential piece of equipment that you consider when doing field work?
If it's in the sub-antarctic, I'd say a good coat.
Good coat.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what what kind of experiment you're running, or what kind of questions you're trying to answer. The equipment kind of differs, depending on the study that you're doing. It could be, Yagi antenna, which is a big antenna that allows you to pick up the sounds from some receivers on the birds. Yep, exactly. So that ends up being very, very useful, as I sort of alluded to earlier, when you're trying to find your one animal in a sea of thousands and thousands of them. So yeah, if you're doing any studies with radio emitters on birds, then definitely that's the most important, because good luck finding a penguin in the middle of 10,000 that are all the same color and all huddled together.
I'm sure we could fill another hour just talking about the methodology of any of these studies, whether they be yours or any of the others of anybody you know of. The remoteness makes it very challenging. You need to plan meticulously. Your equipment has to be robust. It has to be reliable. And then the animals have to do what you would like them to do. So it's really, really challenging. Now, when I do the bird emergency, I usually have a pretty standard series of questions. I'm not going to ask all of them, but I'm going to ask you a couple of them. Have you got a bucket list? Is there a location that you really want to go and do some work?
How much money do I have?
Oh, well, look, Jeff Bezos has just given you a call and said, I saw that podcast on the bird emergency. I think your work is fantastic. How much? Where do you want to go?
Oh, I think I want to go to the Galapagos Islands and study Galapagos penguins.
That would be pretty wild.
It's a fascinating place. I've been there once, and so I'm a diver, which is the whole, thing that got me into marine ecology in the first place. And as I said, at first I was more about fish and corals and stuff. But I did go on a diving trip in the Galapagos Islands, and that was just unbelievable. And I was lucky enough to see some Galapagos penguins there, so that was incredible.
So that might preempt the next question. Is the Galapagos penguin your favourite bird?
It's not, but I guess there's a whole lot of mystery around it. I don't know. I don't think we know a lot about it. And certainly just having seen it and not, because I, did a lot of background research, obviously, on other species and certainly the species I was working with. But I don't know too much about the Galapagos penguins, and I'm really curious to find out, what it eats, what kind of, specializations it might have. And I think that'd be fascinating.
So what is your favorite bird if it's not the Galapagos penguin?
I will actually say that it's probably the wandering albatross. That is another fascinating bird, not a penguin, but I will still go for this one. They are so clever and so gentle. We have on Kerguelen Island, there's a monitoring program that's looking at wandering albatrosses. One of the biggest flying bird on earth, which is cool by itself. But when we catch them, so we have to sort of block the wind so they can't take off. So we go in between them and the wind, and we kind of just put our hands on their beak like this, and then just wrap our arm against the body so they can't sort of deploy the wings. And sometimes, especially my first goes, when I first try to catch them, sometimes you aim for the beak, but you miss a bit, and they could easily rip your hand off. They have that strength in their beak. They're massive beaks as well, but they're so gentle. They might give you a little nick, but never more than that. And if you hold them, if you know the technique and you hold them, they really, really relax, and they're really just quiet, and they just sit there. Sometimes they even lean on the side and show you their leg, because I think they've figured out that we just want to read the band. And if they're sitting on the nest, we can't do that. That's why sometimes we have to catch them. But yeah, they are just, and, seeing their mating displays and things like that is one of the most fascinating thing I've seen. And it was happening, a meter away from me. Just unbelievable.
Well, I think that's a very good choice. Elodie, thanks so much for being part of the Takeover and the bird emergency. I never thought that somebody would tell me there was a specific technique for giving an albatross a cuddle. But I never thought I would speak to anyone about manipulating a shag to get the stomach contents. So enlightening. Now, if somebody wants to have a look at the work you've done so far and follow you on any of the socials, where should they look?
So good question. I'm on Twitter. The handle is at Elodie Camprasse. So first letter of my name and full name. I've got a blog as well. Gee, I should know the handle. We can post it in the chat.
It's okay. We'll put that in the link for the show notes and also on the website when it goes up. Pint of Science. Sorry to interrupt you. What?
No, I was going to say, yeah, it is a bit old, that blog, but it's a multilingual blog, so it's both in French and in English. And I was just sort of posting notes when I had time in the field, and there's a fair few photos in there as well.
There's some very cool photos in there. Some very cool photos, especially of king penguins. So I will certainly link to that and direct people to have a squiz. Now, if people want to follow more of the participants in Pint of Science Takeover, where do they go?
Yes, so on the Pint of Science website, it probably is the best place to go. So pintofscience.com.au. There's a festival tab showing all the projects that are happening, including the Takeover. So we're posting the links to the interviews that have happened throughout the months of May as part of this project. We've had a few already released, but most of them are coming up later during the months. So if you're having a sneak peek now, that's great, but do check regularly, because we'll be adding a whole bunch of interviews. I think at this stage we had about 15 or 16. So really looking forward to these presenters just sharing their work. They work on a wide range of topics, and they're usually fascinating. So yeah, do tune in and have a look at those.
And for the regular Bird Emergency listeners, subscribers, you will get the Pint of Science presenters, academics, consecutive days during the festival on the Bird Emergency. Now, if you are into the Bird Emergency, follow me on Twitter @Bird Emergency, and we're on Facebook, YouTube. Really easy to find, Bird Emergency Podcast. And we're streaming out on Twitch whenever I'm talking to someone. So if you're into Twitch, Grant Bird Nerd, just find me there. Because whenever I speak to someone, we go live. Elodie, thanks so much for being part of the show. And I'm pretty sure that we'll be talking again when it comes to seabirds. I think you have some fascinating tales to tell. 6 months in the sub-antarctic, more than once. That's amazing.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And yes, happy to come back. Happy to talk about birds all day, and penguins or seabirds in general, for sure.
That's great. Yes, I didn't go through the whole Bird Emergency standard questions, but we can maybe do that next time when we do a seabird specialty. That's it, everybody. I'm Grant Williams. Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, because that's where we do a lot of fun on bird Twitter. Thank you again, Elodie Camprasse, and thanks to the Pint of Science for inviting me to be part of their festival.
Thank you, Grant.